My job is to talk about the breadth of humanism. And I only have about 20 minutes, so I've been working on it for a while. In fact, I've spent my whole life studying religions. And one of the interesting things was in the 60s, I guess I was on job 2, we had a national study of religious studies as it was emerging. And we said the center of gravity has shifted from the seminaries to the colleges, which was a good sign, because now many of us who were outsiders or unbelievers or whatever it is were now recognized as scholars. In fact, when I first joined the organization, it was right here, well, at Union Seminary near here. There was a meeting of the NABI, N-A-B-I. Those of you who know Hebrew know that that's the word for prophet. But it was the acronym for the National Association of Biblical Instructors. Fortunately, it outgrew that and became the American Academy of Religion. But included in religion, which is very hard to define, are a whole series of things, and that's what I want to get us into. I've often told people I study viruses, and some are good or helpful, many are not, and religions fit that category. One of the early sociologists of religion said religions cooperate when they're weak, and as soon as they get strong, they get like empires, or they get dominant. And we're seeing that today. I don't know if you've seen the latest Pew study, which is a beautiful study. In America, of course, religious affiliations are declining. And so we say, well, secularization's right around the corner. Ah, yes, but one religion is growing fast, and that's Islam. But go for the Council on Foreign Relations study of Islam, and you'll come away from it, I think, saying, let's stop dropping bombs over there. Bombs don't help at all. For a long time, for centuries, these various versions of Islam got along fairly well until the West began to meddle. I guess that's the right word. And that meddling often caused all kinds of things. Now, here we are, a group of essentially unbelievers. Here we are at the Institute for Humanist Science. You see, how do these fit? And so I'm to talk about the breadth of humanism, and I guess what I have to talk about is a series of, I wrote in my notes here, use the word squabble. How do we study humanism? Well, I would say first we have to talk about the context in which it emerges. And here's an American context in which most of people here believe, not here, but out there, believe in some kind of supernatural powers. 25% of the Americans believe in reincarnation. I'm not sure they know what that means. You know, you get a question there. Do they really pick up an essentially belief of India and bring it here? Or do they simply say, well, you know, I don't want to die? And so the argument has been, many of us have said, one of the things that generates religions is this fear of death. Well, what if you had a good life? Not a bad life, and somebody said, hey, there's a great life there. I remember hearing Billy Graham on his first sermon. He had a tent revival in Los Angeles when I was a graduate student, and he said to this almost all white audience, you know, in heaven you're going to have servants. And I thought, what went through their minds? But that was the beginning of a career, you see. But the assumption that if this life is bad enough, you're going to want another life is part of religion. It's not the only part. Part of it's good marketing. There are a whole series of attempts to explain why we have so many religions, but that's the context in which humanism emerged. Now, how do we study humanism? Well, I would say, first of all, we look at the manifestos. Let's take the one of 1933. It comes at the end of a terrible depression, for many intellectuals, a collapse of an economic system, and some even said, it's socialist, how dare they? But it was signed by a number of Unitarian ministers. It was signed by some very liberal rabbis, some ethical culture people. It was a very interesting document to look at and look back on. And the words, and then we studied the manifestos. There have been a series of them. very complicated. Sometimes you almost go into court to who has the right to write the manifestos. But then we have to look at the humanist organizations. And we have to look at the American Humanist Association first, I think, in this country, and see its various divisions over time. And then we have to begin to look not only at them, but at their journals. And pretty soon, we have to learn to look at the internet, because that suddenly spreads out the possibilities of non-belief to all kinds of people. Websites, podcasts, the first and still running, and probably one of the best podcasts, is Point of Inquiry. You're going to meet a man tomorrow who created that, DJ. And so the attempt somehow to get people who've outgrown childhood religion, which is only about 30% of the present population in America, the attempt to get them somehow cooperating, working together, has been a difficult one. I've used this word squabbles, and those of you who know anything about the history of the humanist groups in America know that squabbles have been part of the center of the things. Partly because when you leave that childhood faith, you often leave a family, you often leave friends, you often leave neighbors, and you become very marginal. And being marginal, you have to define carefully what kind of marginality it is. It's interesting that the web has opened up things, and our fights now among the humanist organizations are, should you put up a billboard that defies God belief, or should you be nicer to at least the liberal Protestants, if there are some, and there are some, should you have interfaith cooperation, or should you have in-your-face push? And we differ sharply on that. One of the interesting things that's just started to come up is a look back at the heresies of history. Most of us know about Jefferson doing his Bible with the scissors, cut out all the miracles and those stories, and what's left, the ethics, you know, that's the Bible. But few of us know how much Lucretius figured in Jefferson's life, or even before Lucretius, Epicurus figured in his life. And we're beginning to get books. There's a new book out titled Nature and Nature's God, The Heresies of the American Founders. Almost unknown. And way back behind here is Spinoza, and way back behind him you see are these other people who begin to talk about, let's study nature. In fact, there's apparently an article in Maclean's coming out about spirituality, and the author, a university professor, believe it or not, defines spirituality as belief in gods, something supernatural, nature, something transcendental. What's left? Or, of course, sociologists are now using the term spiritual but not religious, and asking people if that's what you are. But we're here at a different kind of conference, and we're asking different kinds of questions. We're saying, for those who have left the faith, some faith that they were raised with, or maybe never had a faith, a few of us never had a faith, what happens at the end of that curve? And what is humanism, the best name for these various movements that we've emerged? I try to define it here. I said it's the only known world for our kind of evolved life. I'm sorry. We agree on certain things, and one of them is that we live in the only evolved world for our kind of life. Higher primates, including Homo sapiens, are wired both for altruism and selfishness. And it's culture and maturation that actually shape their behaviors. Now, that's almost humanism in a sentence. Humanism today, comprised of philosophical naturalists, that doesn't mean people who look at flowers, philosophical naturalists, this is one world, we know it this way. Knowledge comes from curiosity, empirical sensory experiences, hypotheses, testing. That's what most of us call science. knowledge comes from that, and knowledge is always superior to beliefs. All evidence shows a finite life curve from birth to death. I don't want to say conception, birth to death. Meaning is how we behave along this curve, how we have effects on others, how we build better environments and cultures for future generations. Our arts are the ways that we reshape and reorder and transmit our cultures, whether it's based on religions. Of course, many cultures have been based on religions. I have to put an S on that because I can't define it in the singular. I can say religions are what religious people are doing at some point in space and time. Cultures are shaped by religions, typically, but today we are shaping cultures in different ways. They're shaped by secular ideologies, none of which have worked very well. We've seen the rise and death of Stalinism. Or they're shaped by knowledge. Now, humanists try to live free of both illusions and delusions until the end of our curve. But we have continuing needs, which religious people have had too. At the end of that curve, our continuing needs, we mourn, we honor the dead, we celebrate their lives, we celebrate their legacies. Many of our groups use words like dignity and compassion. I've always been struck by a phrase that Horace Mann said just before his death. He became president of Antioch College. This was in 1859. He said, "Be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for humanity." Not bad. Now, what happens in the emergence of humanism? That 1933 manifesto, signed by all those Unitarians, by a number of academics, and by, here we are at Columbia, by John Dewey. By John Dewey, began to look in a different direction than we had looked. Dewey's already tried to develop a philosophy that will be practical and not simply theoretical, that will be highly based on the sciences, and above all will be based on an assessment of consequences. Not what some God or text said you should do, but what works and doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, change it. Do something better. And so I did a paper once from Dewey to Hooke to Kurtz. I'm going to talk more about Kurtz tomorrow. But this organization tries to remember the style of Paul Kurtz and the way he was able to build a different kind of world, a world that not only talked about science, but talked about art and talked about culture, and a world that didn't look simply to some past, but that moved ahead. 2 years ago, we were here, and we were hearing Philip Kitcher, who's in the Dewey Chair here at Columbia, and he used this wonderful phrase, not progress toward, but progress from. So that in some sense, humanists are continually saying, couldn't we do better what we're doing now? And how could we do that, and how should we do that, and how would we do that if we had the kind of power that we ought to have? This breadth of organizations that we have takes us into a different world. It makes us marginal. You are fairly marginal or you wouldn't be here. But it makes us think about what we need to do now. And one of the things, and again, one of our humanists reminding us of this, because it, as he says, he had to learn himself from the data. The common knowledge was wrong. You know, we live in such a bloody time. You know, I'm thinking of Steven Pinker. Reminds us that violence, fewer of us die from violent deaths now than ever before in human history, despite Holocausts, World War IIs, and all the rest. And so we need to move through that and find ways of being different. Different in not only what we profess, but what we want for the future and how we look at the past and talk about the future. Now, those of us in this position have trouble dying. More and more of our hospitals are controlled by churches. This is the problem. How do we face death? What do we do with euthanasia? We've been talking about that as humanists. We vary. And the wonderful thing about it, and this is one of the things I think Kitcher's made so beautifully clear, the more we become a democratic society, the more we argue, not the less, because we have different opinions of where we ought to go. And so that we humanists, the common phrase is like herding cats, we cats, are part of the future because we are debating, but debating in essentially pragmatic terms that come from Dewey and his redoing of philosophy that lead us in different directions. Now, we've got 3 speakers tonight, and each of them is going to take 30 minutes. You're going to have some little cards on the table, and you can frame questions, either for one of the speakers or for all 3 of them. And we will have a common question period at the end. The speakers' details are all in your programs here. I'm going to, instead of taking time from their speeches, I'm going to say, number 1 is Annalita.